Every afternoon, as the sun began to sink and painted the quiet street with shades of gold, the neighbors would witness the same curious sight. Clara, a gentle woman with a thoughtful heart, would take her golden retriever, Max, for his daily walk. Unlike other dogs who stopped to sniff the grass, chase after squirrels, or wag their tails at children, Max had a routine that puzzled everyone. At every single mailbox, without fail, he would suddenly stop, stiffen his body, and bark with all his might. His barks weren't playful or random. They were sharp, loud, and carried a weight that made people pause for a second. Sometimes, windows even rattled from the intensity of his voice. At first, people found it strange. Soon, it became a kind of entertainment. Children nicknamed him the barking mail dog, laughing every time he passed their house. Elderly neighbors would shake their heads and joke, "He must really hate mailmen." But Clara never laughed. There was something in Max's eyes when he barked, a fierce focus, almost like he was trying to say something that no one else understood. His ears stood high, his body tense, his tail rigid, as if he was standing guard against something unseen. Clara had adopted Max from the shelter months ago. All she knew was that he once belonged to an elderly man who had passed away. His past beyond that was a mystery. But why did he bark at every mailbox? What was he trying to communicate? While others shrugged it off, Clara couldn't. Each day, as Max barked and barked, the question only dug deeper into her mind, leaving her unsettled. Max's barking wasn't just some silly quirk that dogs pick up. Clara could feel it in her bones that there was something deliberate behind it. Each time they reached a new mailbox, his entire body would change. His muscles would tighten as though he were bracing himself. His tail, normally wagging freely, would stiffen into a rigid line. His golden ears would perk up, and his eyes, usually soft and full of warmth, would narrow into sharp, searching glances. Then the barking would begin, loud and insistent, as if he were demanding attention from someone or something invisible. Clara often stood there holding the leash, staring down at him in both confusion and unease. This wasn't the bark of a dog irritated by noise or startled by movement. It was the bark of a creature on a mission, as if each mailbox carried a hidden secret he was trying to uncover. Clara couldn't help but replay in her mind how little she truly knew about Max's history. When she adopted him from the shelter nearly a year ago, she had been told very little. The staff only mentioned that Max once belonged to an elderly man who had passed away unexpectedly, leaving the loyal dog behind. The details of that life, the man's home, his habits, even how deeply Max had been attached to him, remained mostly a mystery. Sometimes Clara wondered if Max's strange behavior had roots in that old life, if these mailboxes somehow stirred up memories he couldn't let go of. To her, his bark sounded less like frustration and more like a search, a desperate call toward something long lost, something he could never explain with words. And that thought lingered in her heart, making her wonder if she had adopted not just a dog, but also the weight of an untold story. One warm summer evening, the golden light of the setting sun spilled across the quiet neighborhood street as Clara walked with Max, just like they had done countless times before. Everything felt familiar, the rhythm of their footsteps, the gentle sway of his leash, and the expectation that, as always, Max would bark fiercely at every single mailbox they passed. Yet that day, something shifted. When they reached the sixth mailbox on the street, Max's entire demeanor changed. Instead of launching into his usual fit of barking, he froze in place. His body stiffened, his head tilted slightly, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the mailbox as though it held a secret only he could sense. Clara stopped as well, puzzled by his silence. Slowly, Max's ears drooped, no longer alert and sharp. His tail lowered until it barely brushed the pavement. Then, with a quiet, heart-tugging whimper, he lowered himself onto the ground and sat right in front of the mailbox, his gaze fixed upon it. Clara tugged gently at the leash, whispering his name, but Max wouldn't move an inch. He wasn't being stubborn the way dogs sometimes are. This was different, almost reverent, like he was standing guard or mourning. For the first time, his refusal carried a weight that made Clara's chest tighten. The street around them was still, but the moment felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the mailbox he had been searching for all along. Curiosity tugged at Clara's heart as she crouched beside the weathered old mailbox, running her fingers over the cracked wood. Its once bright paint had chipped away under years of sun and rain, leaving only a faded, tired surface. The numbers, almost illegible, were barely clinging on, as though the house and its stories had long been forgotten. But what caught Clara's eye was a small, rusted nameplate fastened to the side. She leaned closer, squinting in the dimming light until the letters became clear. Mr. Thompson. For a moment, Clara froze. The name rang inside her mind like a bell echoing down a long, empty hall. A chill ran down her spine as she remembered the shelter papers she had read when adopting Max. They had mentioned, almost casually, that his first owner was a retired schoolteacher named Harold Thompson, an elderly man who had passed away suddenly, leaving Max without a home. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned her eyes to Max. He wasn't looking at her, nor at the leash, nor at the street around them. His eyes were locked onto that old mailbox, steady and unblinking, as if he recognized it, as if every bark on every other mailbox had only been a desperate search that finally ended here. Clara felt the weight of the moment press into her chest. The barking wasn't random, not some silly quirk. It had been memory, longing, and grief guiding him all along. Max let out a low, mournful howl that rose softly into the quiet evening air, the kind of sound that didn't just echo in the street, but sank deep into the heart. He lowered his head and, with a tenderness that felt almost human, placed his paw against the old wooden post of the mailbox. Clara stood frozen, watching her loyal companion tremble as though every fiber of his being was reaching back in time. It wasn't a bark of warning or impatience anymore. It was a cry of remembrance. Clara's throat tightened, her eyes stinging with tears. In that instant, the puzzle pieces of Max's behavior fell perfectly into place. He hadn't been barking at random, nor trying to scare away invisible threats. No, Max had been searching. Each mailbox along the street had been a question, a plea, a desperate hope that somewhere, just somewhere, a trace of Harold Thompson remained. And now, at last, he had found it. The scent, faint and aged though it must have been, clung stubbornly to this one mailbox, the last marker of a life once lived, of a bond once unbroken. Clara reached down and gently touched Max's head, feeling the shudder of his breath beneath her hand. She whispered softly, "You found him, didn't you, boy?" In her heart, she knew this wasn't about a mailbox. It was about love, memory, and the devotion of a dog who refused to forget the man who had once been his whole world. The following day, Clara decided to walk the same path again, this time with a quiet heaviness in her chest. She wondered if yesterday had been a momentary reaction, or if Max would once more show her something she hadn't understood before. As they stepped out into the familiar street, the neighbors greeted them with their usual smiles, some jokingly asking if the mail dog patrol was back on duty. Clara only smiled faintly, unsure what to expect herself. But to her surprise, Max was different now. At each mailbox, where once he had barked fiercely, he now passed in silence, head lowered slightly as if acknowledging but no longer searching. His energy wasn't restless anymore. It was calm, steady, as though he had completed some long journey inside his heart. Clara felt her own breathing slow, realizing something had shifted. When they reached Mr. Thompson's weathered mailbox, Max stopped. Without a sound, he sat down gently in the grass beside it, his golden fur catching the morning light. His eyes softened, no longer sharp or searching, but warm, remembering. He did not whine or bark. He simply stayed still, his tail stretched calmly behind him. Clara's heart tightened at the sight. It was as though Max had found the one place in the world where his restless spirit could rest. The neighbors noticed too. Some paused to watch, whispering among themselves. The dog who once barked at everything had finally gone silent. Everyone could see it now. Max had found the place he had been looking for all along, the last piece of home he still carried in his heart. Clara bent down, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a small bouquet of fresh wildflowers at the base of Mr. Thompson's old wooden mailbox. The flowers looked fragile against the weathered post, their colors bright but gentle, like a quiet tribute to a bond that time itself could not erase. Max leaned forward and sniffed them softly, his nose lingering for a moment before he gave a slow, content sigh. Then, without hesitation, he curled up in the grass beside the mailbox, resting his golden head against the earth as though he had finally found the home he had been searching for all this time. Clara's eyes welled with tears. To any passerby, it was just an ordinary mailbox on an ordinary street. But to Max, this was no simple wooden box for letters. It was a doorway, a threshold between past and present, memory and reality. It was the last piece of his first family, the one place where love still lingered in the air strong enough for him to recognize. Watching him breathe calmly, Clara understood that his restless barking had never been about noise or mischief. It had been about loyalty, about holding on to someone he loved even when the world moved on. For Max, the journey was complete. He no longer needed to bark or search. In that quiet moment, wrapped in memory and devotion, he was home. From that day forward, Max's daily walks were no longer filled with restless barking. The once noisy golden retriever, who had startled every neighbor with his voice at each mailbox, now carried himself in silence. His paws patted gently across the pavement, tail swaying slowly, but his eyes always searching for the one familiar post. And when he reached it, the weathered wooden mailbox with a faded nameplate of Mr. Thompson, he would stop, lower himself onto the grass, and sit in still remembrance. There was no sound, no cry, just a quiet devotion that spoke louder than words ever could. Clara often stood beside him, her hand resting on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She realized in those moments that Max wasn't just remembering his old master, he was teaching her something. Love doesn't vanish with time, nor does it die when someone is gone. It lingers quietly, waiting for recognition, hidden in the most ordinary corners of life. To Max, it was a mailbox. To Clara, it became a lesson that the bonds we make outlive us, etched not in stone, but in hearts. And so, on that forgotten street, by that simple wooden post, love remained